Please support this channel by subscribing. Your support means everything to us and helps us keep creating stories like this. No one in the lower halls of Blackthorn Keep lasted long, and everyone knew why, even if no one said it out loud. Because beyond the cold marble corridors and the silver-lit towers lived a child whose sorrow had turned into something dangerous. A child who screamed and made glass burst. A child whose shadows moved when they should not. And on a night when rain whispered against the high windows and the guards were changing shifts, a tired human woman pushed her cleaning cart through those halls without knowing that her life was about to cross the path of the most feared little girl in the vampire realm. Her name was Eliza Gray, and before the castle she had been many things. A wife, a mother, and then finally only a survivor. Because 2 years earlier, a sickness had taken her husband and her young son in the same winter, leaving her with nothing but quiet rooms and memories that hurt too much to touch. And when the village could no longer offer her work, she went where desperate people went, to places no one else wanted to work. And that was how she became a janitor in a vampire king's castle, cleaning halls that never seemed to grow warm and rooms that smelled of stone and old power. The servants whispered as she passed, not cruelly, but with the kind of fear that makes people speak in low voices. And Eliza did not understand their words at first, only that they spoke about the West Wing, about screams in the night, about caretakers who left pale and shaking, or who did not return at all. And she did what she had learned to do since the world had broken her. She kept her head down, did her work, and tried not to notice how sadness seemed to live in the walls themselves. The vampire king's daughter, Princess Seraphina, had not always been like this. Or so the older servants said when they thought no one important was listening. Because once she had run through these halls laughing, once she had brought light into rooms that had never known it, but her human mother had died suddenly, and something inside the little princess had shattered with her. And grief, mixed with a strange and ancient power in her blood, had become something that no one could control. Not the mages, not the doctors, not even the king himself. That night, Eliza was told to clean near the West Wing. Only the outer corridor, never the door at the end, never the chamber behind it, and she nodded, because she had learned not to argue with guards who carried silver weapons and eyes full of warning, and she worked quietly, the soft sound of her mop echoing in the long, empty hall, until she heard something that did not belong in a castle of monsters and soldiers. A sound so small and broken that it stopped her breath in her chest. It was crying, not the kind of scream people had described, not the violent, earth-shaking rage that made walls crack, but a soft, tired sob, the kind a child makes when she has cried for too long and no one has come. And Eliza's hands froze around the handle of her mop, because she had heard that sound before, in another life, in another small room. When her own son had been sick and afraid in the dark, she told herself to walk away, because everyone else did, because humans did not survive getting close to the king's daughter, because she was just a cleaner and this was not her place. But her feet did not listen, and before she understood what she was doing, she had left her cart behind and was walking slowly toward the half-open door at the end of the corridor. Cold air spilled out from the room like breath from a cave, and shadows clung to the walls in ways that made her skin prickle, but the crying was still there. Softer now, almost like it was running out. And Eliza did not step inside. She only knelt near the doorway, as if approaching a frightened animal, and from deep inside her memory, she pulled something she had not used in years. A simple lullaby she used to sing when storms frightened her child. Her voice was not strong, and it trembled, but it was gentle, and she sang as if she were singing to someone who might break if the world was too loud. And for a few heartbeats nothing happened, and then, slowly, the crying stopped. The shadows did not move. The air did not crack out, and from the darkness inside the room, a small, thin voice whispered, "Don't stop." Eliza stayed there, kneeling on cold stone, singing to a child she could not yet see, not knowing that high above them, in a tower filled with silence and old power, the vampire king had just been told that for the first time in months, his daughter had gone quiet. By the time Eliza returned to her small, narrow room beneath the servants' stairs, the castle was already buzzing with a quiet, nervous energy, the kind that did not belong to celebrations or feasts, but to rumors and fear. And she did not need anyone to tell her that something she had done had been noticed, because 2 guards were waiting for her at her door before she could even set her bucket down, and they did not speak harshly, but their hands rested too close to their weapons for comfort as they told her that the king wished to see her. She walked through halls she had only seen from far away, past pillars carved with ancient victories and windows that showed a sky that never truly became day. And with every step her courage tried to leave her, because she was only a janitor, a human woman in a place ruled by beings who could end her life with a thought. And she kept telling herself that all she had done was sing to a crying child. But in this castle, even kindness could be dangerous. The throne room was colder than any other place she had cleaned. And when she entered, she felt as if the shadows themselves were watching her. And at the far end, on a throne that looked carved from night and bone, sat the vampire king, tall, still, and terrifying in a quiet, controlled way. And she understood in that moment why whole regions feared his name, because his eyes were not angry, they were tired. And that was somehow worse. "You went to the West Wing," he said, and his voice was calm, but it filled the room like a storm waiting to break. And Eliza's knees almost gave way, yet she forced herself to stand straight and nod, because lying felt more dangerous than truth. "I heard a child crying," she said, her voice small but steady, "and I could not pretend I did not." There was a long silence, and she could feel the eyes of unseen courtiers and guards on her back, waiting to see if she would be punished for her foolishness. And then the king spoke again, telling her things everyone already knew, that 23 caretakers had failed, that mages had been driven away, that his daughter's grief had turned into something that hurt anyone who tried to get close. And he asked her why she thought she would be any different. Eliza did not answer right away, because the truth was not brave or clever, and when she finally spoke, she said, "I am not different, Your Majesty. I am just someone who knows what it is like to lose everything and still wake up the next day." Something in the room shifted, not warmth, but a small change in the air, and the king studied her as if he were seeing her for the first time, not as a servant, but as a person. And then he told her she would try, that she would go to his daughter every evening, that no guard would protect her, and that if she ran or failed, she would be sent away and never allowed near the West Wing again. When Eliza left the throne room, her legs were shaking, but her decision was already made, because fear had taken enough from her life. And that night, when the bells of the castle marked the rise of the moon, she returned to the cold corridor and the half-open door. This time, she did not sing right away, and she did not step inside. She only spoke softly, telling the child her name, telling her she had brought a clean blanket and some bread that no one had touched. And for a long time, there was no answer, until a small voice asked from the darkness why she had come back, and Eliza said simply, "Because you were alone." Princess Seraphina did not come close, and Eliza did not ask her to, but she sat on the floor near the doorway and talked about small, unimportant things, about how the castle floors were always cold, about how the stars looked different from different windows, about how sometimes it helped to talk even when no one answered. And slowly, like an animal that had been hurt too many times, the child moved closer to the edge of the shadows, When Eliza hummed the lullaby again, the air grew cold, but it did not break, and the shadows trembled but did not strike, and for the first time, Eliza saw the child's face, pale, thin, with eyes too old for someone so young, and when Seraphina finally whispered, "You sound like my mother," Eliza felt her heart tighten, but she did not cry. She only said, "Then maybe she sang like someone who loved you very much." High above them, unseen in the dark corridor, the Vampire King stood still and listened. And for the first time since his wife's death, he did not hear his daughter scream. The third night was the one everyone expected to end badly, because in castles like Blackthorn Keep, hope was something people learned not to trust. And Eliza felt it too, as she walked back toward the west wing with her small bundle of simple things, a clean cloth, a little food, and the broken music box she had found among forgotten storage rooms. Not because it worked, but because it looked like something that once had. And she did not know why, but she felt the child might understand what it was meant to be. When she reached the door, the air was colder than before, and the shadows along the walls moved like slow breathing. And before she could knock, a sound rolled through the corridor, not crying this time, but a low, shaking hum. Like the castle itself was in pain, and Eliza's heart began to race, because she understood that something was wrong. Inside the chamber, Princess Seraphina was standing in the center of the room, her small hands clenched, her silver hair floating as if stirred by a wind that did not exist. And around her the air twisted and darkened, and Eliza could feel the pressure of it even from the doorway, a weight of sorrow and anger that did not belong in any child's body. "I don't want to remember," the girl whispered, her voice breaking, and the shadows answered her, crawling up the walls like living things, and the temperature dropped so fast that frost began to creep across the floor. Eliza did not think, because thinking would have told her to run, and instead she stepped inside, her boots crunching softly on the forming ice, and she spoke Seraphine's name like it was something fragile, like it might break if she said it too loudly. The child turned toward her, and for a moment Eliza saw something ancient and terrible in those eyes, something that did not belong to grief alone, and the shadows surged forward. And a guard watching from far down the hall later would swear he felt the air shake as if the castle were about to split. Eliza did not raise her voice, and she did not try to touch the girl. She only began to sing. The lullaby was soft, almost lost under the low roar of the gathering darkness. And for a few seconds it seemed to do nothing at all. And then, like a hand reaching out of deep water, one shadow paused, and then another, and Seraphine's breathing began to change, fast and frightened, but no longer angry. "I can hear her," the girl said, her voice trembling. "She's calling me, and she's so cold." Eliza's chest ached, because she knew that voice, not that mother, but that feeling, the way grief could pretend to be something else. And she walked forward slowly, step by careful step, until she was close enough that the cold burned her skin. "I hear my son sometimes," Eliza said quietly, and the words surprised even her, because she had not planned to say them. "He used to call for me when he had bad dreams, and for a long time after he was gone, I thought I could still hear him. But it was only my heart trying to hold on." The shadows trembled, Seraphine's hands shook, and the air pulsed as if it were breathing with her. "You're lying," the child whispered. But there was no anger in it, only fear. "I wish I were," Eliza answered, and she knelt down on the freezing floor, even as pain bit into her knees. "I wish no one ever had to learn what this feels like." For a long moment, nothing happened, and then the darkness pulled back just a little, like a storm losing its strength. And Seraphina took one unsteady step forward, and then another, until she was close enough that Eliza could see tears freezing on her cheeks. "Does it ever stop hurting?" The child asked. Eliza did not lie. "It changes," she said. "And one day you realize you can breathe again." The air shuddered, and with a sound like breaking glass, the shadows collapsed back into the corners of the room. The frost began to melt, and the weight in the air lifted, leaving only a very small, very tired girl standing in the middle of a ruined chamber. Seraphina swayed, and before Eliza could stop herself, she reached out and caught her, and the cold flared, sharp and dangerous, and then faded, and the child did not pull away in the corridor outside. The vampire king had already moved, but he stopped when he felt the pressure break. And through the half-open door, he saw something he had not seen in months. His daughter asleep in a human woman's arms. And the shadows were quiet. By the fourth day, the castle could no longer pretend nothing was changing, because servants began to notice that the west wing was quieter, because the glass stayed unbroken, because no new caretaker had fled screaming into the night. And whispers started to move through the halls, first with fear, then with something that almost sounded like hope. And that was when the council began to worry. Eliza did not know any of this at first, because her world had become very small, limited to a cold corridor, a broken chamber, and a quiet little girl who sat closer to her each night, sometimes listening, sometimes asking small, careful questions, and sometimes just watching as Eliza cleaned and hummed and spoke about ordinary things that did not hurt. And every night, Seraphina slept for a few hours. Real sleep, not the restless, violent kind that had shaken the castle before, but in the great halls where decisions were made. The old vampires did not see a healing child. They saw a risk. And they saw a human woman standing too close to something powerful. And they had seen enough centuries to know how often that ended badly. Eliza was cleaning a side corridor when two guards approached her, their faces careful and unreadable, and told her the council wished to speak with her. And she felt that familiar cold in her stomach, the one that came when the world was about to remind her how small she was, but she went anyway, because turning away would only make things worse. The council chamber was a wide, circular room carved from dark stone, and the elders sat in a half-circle like statues that had learned to speak. And they asked her questions in voices that did not hide their doubt. How long had she been near the princess? What exactly had she done? What spells did she use? And Eliza told them the truth, that she sang, that she listened, that she stayed. And some of them looked almost offended by the simplicity of it. One of them, tall and thin with eyes like cold glass, said what the others were thinking, that this could not be allowed to continue, that the princess was too dangerous, that her power should be sealed or she should be moved to a deeper, more secure place, and that a human woman had no right to be part of this decision. Eliza felt her hands shake, but she remembered Seraphine's small fingers clutching her sleeve when the shadows crept too close. And she spoke before she could stop herself, saying that the child was not a weapon, that she was a little girl who had lost her mother, and that locking her away would only teach her that the world was something to fear. The room fell into a heavy silence, and then a familiar, colder one replaced it. As the vampire king stepped into the chamber, he did not raise his voice, and he did not threaten anyone. But when he said that no one would touch his daughter, and that no one would remove the woman who had done what none of them could, the council listened, because even in their worry, they still feared him more. That night, when Eliza returned to the west wing, Seraphina was sitting near the window, looking at a patch of dark sky that held a single pale star. And she asked in a small voice if Eliza was going to be sent away like the others. And Eliza felt something twist painfully in her chest as she sat beside her and said that she was still here, and that she had no plans to leave. The child did not answer, but she leaned, just slightly, against Eliza's arm, and it felt like a promise. Later, when the candles were low, the shadows stirred again, not in anger, but in uncertainty, and Seraphine's breathing quickened, and Eliza did not sing this time. She only took the girl's cold hand in her own and held it, and the cold burned, but it did not push her away. In the corridor, the vampire king stood and watched, and he realized that for the first time since his wife's death, his daughter was not alone in her fear, and for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that perhaps this fragile, stubborn human woman was not a mistake, but the beginning of something he had thought was gone forever, and far away. In the deepest parts of the castle, the council began to plan, because even miracles made them uneasy. The night everything nearly fell apart began in silence, the kind that feels too heavy to be peaceful, and Eliza sensed it the moment she stepped into the west wing, because the air was tight and cold in a way she had not felt since the third night, and even before she reached the door, she could hear Seraphina breathing fast inside the room, not crying, not screaming, but fighting something she could not see. When Eliza entered, the candles were already flickering wildly, and the shadows were stretched thin along the walls like dark veins, and Seraphina was sitting on the floor with her hands over her ears, her eyes wide and unfocused, and she whispered again and again that the voices were back, that they were telling her she did not belong here, that she was broken, that everyone would leave her in the end. Eliza knelt in front of her, her heart pounding, and told her to look at her. But the child could not, and the temperature dropped so fast that frost raced across the floor. And this time it did not stop. Somewhere far away, an alarm bell began to ring. The shadows rose, not slowly, but like a wave breaking against the walls, and the room seemed to shrink under their weight. And Eliza understood that this was not just fear, not just grief, but something deeper, something that had been waiting for a moment of weakness. The door burst open behind her, and guards filled the corridor, and beyond them, tall and terrible and pale as carved stone, stood the vampire king. And for a heartbeat, Eliza thought he would order them to pull her away, to save what could still be saved. Instead, he said only, "Get out," and his voice carried enough power that the guards obeyed without question, because this was not something weapons could fix. Eliza turned back to Seraphina just as a crack ran through the far wall, and dust fell from the ceiling, and the child screamed, not in anger, but in pure, broken terror. "She's going to take me," Seraphina cried, and Eliza knew without being told who she meant. And she did the only thing she could think of, the bravest and most foolish thing. She pulled the child into her arms. The cold hit her like a blade, and pain exploded through her chest and arms. And for a moment she thought she would lose consciousness, but she did not let go. And she began to speak, not sing, but speak, telling Seraphina about her son, about the night he was too weak to breathe, about how she had held him and begged the world not to take him, and how even when it did, she had still loved him enough to keep going. The shadows pressed closer, and the air screamed, and somewhere in the chaos, the vampire king took a step forward and then stopped, because he saw something he did not understand. A human woman standing in the center of a storm of power, refusing to run. "You are not broken," Eliza said, her voice shaking but clear. "You are hurting. And that is not the same thing. And I am not leaving you." For a long moment, nothing changed. And then Seraphine's grip tightened around her, and the child buried her face in Eliza's shoulder and sobbed. And with that sound, the shadows faltered. The frost began to melt. The walls stopped shaking. The pressure in the air eased, little by little, until the room was only a room again, broken and cold, but standing, Seraphina did not let go for a long time. And when she finally lifted her head, her eyes were still red, but they were clear. "I thought you would run," she whispered. Eliza smiled weakly. "I already ran once," she said. "I don't want to do it again." In the doorway, the vampire king closed his eyes just for a second, and when he opened them, something in his expression had changed. Something old and proud had bent into something quieter. He knelt down in front of them, the ruler of 1,000 years, lowering himself to the level of a human woman and a frightened child. And he said, "You have my word. No one will take her from you. Not tonight. Not ever." And for the first time, Seraphina looked at her father without fear. Asterisk morning never truly came to Blackthorn Keep, but something close to it did, a softer kind of darkness, a quiet that felt like rest instead of waiting. And Eliza noticed it first when she walked through the west wing and did not feel the cold bite her bones, because the air felt still, not empty. And when she opened the door to Seraphine's chamber, she found the girl sitting on the bed, awake, calm, and holding a small silver brush in her hands. "I slept," Seraphina said, as if it were a secret, and Eliza smiled. Because in this castle, it was, from that day on, things did not become perfect, but they became possible. And that was more than anyone had hoped for, because Seraphina still had bad nights. And sometimes the shadows still whispered, but they no longer ruled her. And when fear came, she reached for Eliza instead of the dark. The castle began to change in small ways, the kind that only people who live in quiet places notice, because servants started walking through the west wing without flinching, because the council stopped speaking about sealing doors and started speaking about lessons and time, and because the vampire king began to appear in the halls again, not as a distant ruler hiding from his own grief, but as a father learning how to stay. One evening, he asked Eliza to walk with him through the garden that had been closed since his wife's death. And as they stood among flowers that had only just begun to bloom again, he told her that his daughter had spoken about her, not as a caretaker, not as a servant, but as someone who stayed. And he said thank you in a voice that did not belong to a king, but to a man who had almost forgotten how. The council did not like it. Not at first, but when weeks passed and the castle did not fall, and the princess did not scream, and the shadows did not rise, even the oldest among them had to admit that something had been healed, not by magic or force, but by patience. Eliza was offered many things: a better room, fine clothes, a title that sounded important, and she accepted only one thing: to stay where she was needed, because she had learned that some wounds did not need rewards. They needed time. One night, as Seraphina brushed her hair in front of the mirror, she asked a small, careful question: if Eliza would stay even when she was grown. And Eliza answered honestly that she did not know what the future held, but that for now she was here, and that was enough. And the girl smiled, not the fragile, uncertain smile of before, but a real one. In the great hall, months later, when the vampire king finally stood before his court and spoke not of war or borders, but of change, he said something that no one had ever heard him say before. That strength without kindness was only another kind of weakness, and that day, some of the old ways began to die. And in a small chamber that had once been full of screams, a human woman and a vampire child sat by the window, watching a single pale star, and the world, for the first time in a long while, felt like it might be kind. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to fight the darkness, but to sit beside it and remind it that it is not alone.